Let me introduce you to an unlikely feminist hero. No, not that guy. This one. Yes, Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher who once wrote that women should be able to do anything men can do. Plato presents an idealized version of the city-state of Atlantis, who engages in dialogue with various interlocutors to explore different perspectives on the nature of justice and the ideal society. In the Republic, Socrates argues that women should receive the same education as men, and that they should be able to engage in intellectual and philosophical pursuits. For example, in Book 5 of the Republic, well, not necessarily, who argues that Plato's views on women should be understood in the context of ancient Greek conceptions of the soul. Ancient Greece was a highly patriarchal society, for example. In the Republic, he argues that men should be the head of the household and that women should be subordinate to them. He also assigns women to certain roles in society, such as spinning and weaving, while men are assigned to others, such as guarding and ruling. Do you think Plato's views on women were ahead of their time, or were they just plain wrong? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These views are more conservative and reflect the patriarchal norms of ancient Greek society, where women were largely confined to the domestic sphere and had limited access to education and public life. This is reflected in Plato's own life, as he came from an aristocratic family and his mother was considered a member of the lower class. Despite this, Plato's views on women were more progressive than those of many of his contemporaries. As mentioned earlier, he argued that women should receive the same education as men, and that they should be able to participate in intellectual and philosophical pursuits. He also challenged the traditional Athenian view that women should be seen and not heard, arguing instead that they should be allowed to speak their minds and participate in public life. Additionally, Plato's use of female characters in his dialogues, such as Aspasia of Miletus, who was a well-known hetaira and a partner of a male philosopher Pericles, challenges the prevailing view of women as passive and subordinate to men. According to Greek thought, the soul was composed of three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. And these parts were often associated with the three traditional gender roles. On the one hand, he was more progressive than many of his contemporaries in his advocacy for women's education and participation in public life. On the other hand, he also reinforced traditional gender roles and patriarchal norms. Ultimately, Plato's views on women should be understood in the context of ancient Greek culture and the limitations of his thinking. Despite his flaws, Plato's work has had a profound influence on Western philosophy, and his ideas about women continue to be debated and discussed today. Reason was seen as the most important part of the soul and was associated with the masculine ideal. Spirit was seen as intermediate in importance and was associated with the feminine ideal. Appetite was seen as the lowest part of the soul and was associated with the chthonic or demonic ideal. Chthonic, by the way, refers to the ancient Greek religion, a belief system centered around the worship of deities associated with the underworld or chthonic realm. Is characterized by a focus on rituals intended to communicate with and appease spirits of the dead and other supernatural beings. So basically what Freud is saying is that Plato assigned women to the role of spirit, which was seen as more passive and receptive than the active and initiating role of men. Plato was really into hierarchy, whether it was in the political sphere or in the realm of the soul. And that's why he placed reason, the highest faculty, in the hands of men. However, this doesn't necessarily imply a devaluation of women as he saw them, nor does it justify his views on gender roles. Instead, it helps us understand the cultural context in which he was writing and the limitations of his thinking. You see, Plato's writings are often complex, and his views on women are no exception. Some scholars argue that Plato's apparent sexism can be interpreted as a critique of Athenian sexism rather than an endorsement of it. For example, some scholars argue that Plato's ideal city with its strict gender roles and exclusion of women from political life, is actually a parody of the real world, Athenian society, which he thought was unjust and oppressive. In this interpretation, Plato's sexism is not a reflection of his own beliefs, but a way of exposing the sexism of his culture. Socrates argues against the traditional Athenian view that women should be seen and not heard, suggesting instead that they should be allowed to speak their minds and participate in public life. This argument is presented in response to an objection from a character named Thrasymachus, who argues that women are inferior to men and should be excluded from public life. In response, Socrates asks why anyone would want to exclude the intelligent and talented half of the population from participating in public life. This passage is often cited as an early example of feminist thinking, as it challenges traditional gender roles and calls for women to be treated as equal members of society, a utopian society ruled by philosopher kings. But when it comes to women, things aren't so utopian after all. Plato explores the question of whether women should be allowed to participate in the training of young Athenian citizens. He argues that men should be the head of the household and that women should be subordinate to them. He also argues that women should be assigned to certain roles in society, such as spinning and weaving, while men should be assigned to others, such as guarding and ruling. Are you sensing a pattern here? Now, this aspect of Plato's thought is less often discussed, but it's important to remember that Plato lived in a patriarchal society where gender roles were strictly enforced and women were considered inferior to men. His views on women should be understood in this context. It is possible that Plato was trying to be as radical as he could within the confines of his time and place. By advocating for women's education and participation in public life, he was already going against the grain of Athenian thought. But at the same time, he was still very much a product of his culture, and his views on women were ultimately shaped by the social norms and expectations of his day. Once again, Socrates argues that women should be included in the training of youth, suggesting that they are just as capable as men of transmitting knowledge and skills to the next generation. Plato even goes so far as to suggest that women who have been properly educated can make better soldiers than men who have not. Yet despite these progressive views, Plato also reinforces traditional gender roles in other parts of his work. For example, in Book 4, Plato introduces the concept of a guardian class, a group of elite male citizens responsible for protecting and leading the state. These guardians would be selected from the most promising young men through a rigorous education system and would be required to live a life of strict discipline and self-control. You might think this sounds like a recipe for disaster, but don't worry, because Plato makes sure to remind us that this whole thing applies only to men. Women, according to him, would have exactly the same role models and upbringing as men, but would instead be tasked with managing the households of the city. Sure, that sounds great. You get to overthrow corrupt leaders and run a country based on reason and justice, but only if you're a man. Otherwise, you're relegated to housework. Thanks, Plato. Wait, no, he didn't. He actually said that they shouldn't. Well, Plato is pretty much the poster boy for what we today call toxic feminism. But how did this happen? To answer this question, we need to look at the ways in which his ideas both were ahead of their time. After all, even though Plato lived 24 centuries ago, he is still widely read and studied. And Plato was both praised by feminists and criticized by anti-feminists for his views on gender roles. So what was so groundbreaking about his thinking? And how did it end up being both progressive and regressive at the same time? Let's find out. Our story begins in ancient Athens, a place and time notorious for its limited idea of women's rights. According to Athenian law, women had no right to own property. They could not participate in politics, and they were expected to stay in the home, taking care of domestic duties, while their male counterparts debated politics in the agora or marketplace. Sounds familiar? The situation hasn't changed much, has it? Even today, women are underrepresented in politics worldwide and are still expected to shoulder a disproportionate amount of unpaid caregiving responsibilities. Back then, however, there were some voices calling for more rights and freedoms for women, such as Aspasia of Miletus, a well-known hetaira, a female companion or partner of a male philosopher. In Plato's most famous dialogue, The Republic, Plato's views on women are presented through the character of Socrates. In another dialogue called The Laches, in The Republic, for example, so does that mean Plato was a closet misogynist? Another interesting interpretation is offered by feminist philosopher Catherine Freed. Indeed, many scholars agree that Plato's views on women were shaped by the cultural norms and expectations of his time and place. However, Plato says progressiveness on women's rights is often overshadowed by his reinforcement of traditional gender roles in other parts of his work. In conclusion, Plato's views on women were complex and sometimes contradictory. What do you think?